Here is Tag Kyo Adzuki Iro, a magenta ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
This is a magenta with a strong red lean, a lean that in its darkest form doesn't really show through. Thankfully, there is a ton of tone variation by pen, and it goes from really good to really bad. Really bad. It does shade in its lighter tones, but unfortunately the lighter tones weren't nearly as nice. I'm not a fan for this because really you need to be with the right pen and on the right paper. That seems like too much work to really keep track of. Overall, I'm simply not a fan because of the chance of a bad pen and paper combination with it. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib that writes rather dry. A Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet. A Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow. A Lamy All-Star with a broad nib that writes average.
The pen for today is a Franklin Christoph Model 66.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the soft fine nib, this is the lightest tone that we're going to get on the paper. Now we get a lot of a very nice magenta here. Also some of those red tones. We have no feathering, we have no spread. We do have shading going on. Like I said, you get a nice magenta and some red. Take a look at "and" on the second line where it starts off a bit more red and in that D darkens up a bit to be more that magenta. You also see it very well in the word spiders on the third line where the S is lighter, or the S and the P is lighter, and in the I, D, E it darkens up a bit and then lightens just a little bit on the R, S at the end. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is no shading. This is a beautiful dark magenta the whole way through. And if you were to glance at it quickly, you might even think this is just a different kind of black. It's very dark and beautiful. I normally don't get to see magentas this dark, and I'm enjoying the hell out of it there. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, really showing a bunch of the reds, still holding on to that magenta. No feathering, no spread. It is shading some. I mean, you see it in shaky on the first line, where the SH is darker. It lightens up a bit on the A, dark again at the KY. Not a ton. There on the second line, starts lighter, works its way darker with the here. But what I see a lot of is very good magenta tone, not that dark magenta that we had with the wet fine. Looking at the broad nib, it is showing as much more of the red lean is really coming through here an awful lot. There's no feathering, there's no spread. It does shade the best here, I think because of the combination of the nib flow and the broader nib really being able to show it off. Look at Bifur on the second line, the BI quite dark, the UF much darker, the R very dark again. And right next to that, starts lighter, works its way darker at the D. Naturally, crosses of T's, dots of I's, commas, that sort of thing tend to be very dark. Looking at the back of the page, we have no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 6 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was with the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get, I think, better shading than we had on the Clairfontaine. Kind of a surprise, but it certainly is shading very well. Look at hundreds on the first line. The H starts much darker. It lightens up quite a bit, gets a little bit darker on the RE, and then lightens again at the DS. Spiders on the second line, very light S, darker I, lighter I into the D, very dark DE, light again at the R, dark again at the S. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine, a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. There's no feathering, there's no spread, there's no shading. There is a beautiful tone on the page that makes me happy to have used it all day. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We get kind of a little bit of shading going on. I mean, you see it with had on the first line, where the H is darker than the A into the D, but the downstroke of the D got quite a bit darker. All on the second line shows three different tones with a nice mid-tone at the A, lightening up at the first L, much darker at the second L. Could you ask for anything more? Look at could on the third line. Nice mid, most, very red leaning through most of the word, darkens up a bit with the D at the end. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Really looks kind of more like a faded red magenta-ish, kind of showing some pinkish tones here. Not a fan of the color that I'm seeing. Not having any kind of feathering, not having any kind of spread. One or two moments of shading, like the N and again on the second line, or the he of the on the second line. It's just I'm seeing a tone I'm not happy with, and I wouldn't want to use this combination. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, very, very minor ghosting. I could easily write back here. I wouldn't have any kind of real issue with it. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the Clairfontaine, a bit more red here for sure, not so much magenta. It's red on this paper. No feathering, no spread. There is a little bit of shading, which is not a common thing to get with red inks. So if you were to get that, it's a nice thing. Granted, this is a magenta. Look at but on the first line, where the B is a little bit darker than the U and the T is the darkest letter in that word. Bilbo, underneath that, the beginning of the B is lighter than the loops of the B into the I. It's the L that lightens up, and the B in its downstroke gets much darker, much lighter again into the O. I think the amount of shading we're getting here makes this a very good combination. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It's also looking like a brown with a magenta lean as a result of the tone of the paper. No feathering, no spread, no shading, not the combination I would go for in this case. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, really showing a much more red lean than being a magenta. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We get almost nothing for shading. I think there's some, if you look at think on the second line, where the TH starts darker, the IN lighten up a bit, and then the K quite a bit darker. The underneath it, the T starts lighter, he is much darker. Dwarves next to that, though, gives us a nice solid tone all the way through the writing. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Still no feathering, still no spread. There is some shading going on. If you look at rather, first word, first line, the H and the R are darker than the rest of the word. Sorry, there's not a ton of shading here, like sorry right next to that, where it's only the downstroke of the Y that was a bit darker. Still, it's showing some shading about a bunch of the writing, looking at about right next to that, where the T is darker than the rest of the word. Not to say that there is no shading. When you look at not in the second line, the no is lighter, the T is darker. You do have to look a little bit for some of this shading, though, to be, very plain about it. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting. We have no problem writing back here, which is always a good thing. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is a little bit of shading going on, about as much as we had on the Clairfontaine. Not anything more. I mean, you see it with must, where the U and the T, must on the first line, of course. The U and the T are darker than the M and the S. Make on the second line, the M is a nice mid-tone, the A lightens up, the KE at the end, very dark. Shades well. I think the color stands out even in this lightest tone with these vertical lines. So the quad rule isn't distracting. It's doing a good job. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. It is a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It's a lot lighter. It's really showing itself to be more that magenta with a red lean. With it being a bit lighter, it does shade. I almost forgot to mention because, well, this is Rhodia, so it's rare that it would feather or spread. It does not. The shading does very well. Look at Elf Fires on the second line. The E is very dark. The L lightens just a little bit, and the F gets dark, light at the down swoop of that F, where Fires starts very dark, works its way lighter on the R-E-S at the end. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the wet fine nib. Just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We get very little shading. It is there. It's not shouting at you if you look at shouts on the first line, where the SH is a bit darker than the OU, and the TS darkens up a little bit. So there are some strikes of shading going on, like sticks. Yeah, I didn't have the word I would have preferred there. Sticks on the second line, where the S is lighter than the T, and the IC darker than the T. The K lightens up, looks like a kiss of red right in the middle of the word, where the S is very dark. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Really, as a color, looks more like a pink with a slight magenta lean. There's no feathering, there's no spread, there is shading. I do not like what I'm seeing here just as its color. It's very dull if I were to consider it as a pink in this case, and I don't want to just spend a minute ripping into this. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and we get no ghosting. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Califolio Granate. Here is Diamine Magenta Flash. Here is Krishna Sakthi. Here is Private Reserve Burgundy Mist.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, we get a little bit lighter tone than we had on the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread, only a couple little pepperings of shading throughout. The tone on this paper, that little bit lighter, and the tone of the paper itself, makes the quad rule a bit distracting with this pen. I don't see this as being the best combination here. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, showing much more of being a magenta with a red lean. It shows the red coming through quite well. No feathering, no spread, because this paper does very well. Get your composition notebooks made in Vietnam. Shading, yes. The Addercop on the second line, the A is a little bit lighter than the TT, and the ERCO, much lighter. The P gets very dark again. For an insult, it looks amazing. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get some shading. It's leading the attack, or in the past, led the attack on the first line, where the LE is a bit darker. It lightens into the D, but then gets dark during the D downstroke. And lighter, or darker A, a lighter N, attack. The A is lighter than the two T's, which darkens just a little bit, and they lighten up a little bit again into the AC. The K, very dark, huddled together on the second line. Huddled starts very lighter in tone. It's during the D's that it starts to darken up a bit. The L keeps the tone of those D's, and the ED at the end, very dark. Together, still on the second line, not all of us together, but together on the second line, the TO, much lighter than the G. The ET lightens up a little bit, and her at the end, pretty dark, except the R does lighten some. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It really is looking like a pink with a little bit of red going on. No feathering, no spread, little bits of shading through what's going on. You see through on the first line. The H is darker than what's around it, both of the H's, in fact. The underneath that, the thing is, it's like the top of the T is lighter than the bottom of the T. Lightens in the hoop of the H, but not the top bar of the H. The loop of the E is lighter than the swoop out of the E. The amount of tone shift that's happening looks really nice. It's very subtle, but when you really just stop and admire your horrible penmanship that I have, at least it makes it look better. So I'd give that kid an extra point or two. Looking at the back of the page, you could easily write back here with no bleeding and no ghosting. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Diamine Twilight. Here is Organic Studios Blue Morel. Here is Ackerman Dutch Masters No. 3. Here is Aurora Black.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Yes, we get some feathering. Yes, we get some spread. Neither of those are really an issue in this case. It being a drier writing pen is really helping out. Shading does happen, not all the time, but look at not on the first line. The N shows two different tones. The top of that N is lighter than the bottom of the N, lighter into the O, dark into the T. Look at fast right next to that. Top of the F, lighter than the bottom of the F, lightens into the AS, and very dark T to end things. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Yes, there's feathering. Yes, there's spread. No, there's no shading. No, it's not particularly great. Look at wobble on the first line. I think that's really a great thing. The amount of feathering and spread that's happening on that, and the tone is not particularly inviting to me to want to put it on there. I think if my teachers wrote with this all the time, I'd hate magenta. Not that I hate red. Red's just not my favorite of inks. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. The feathering is less than it was with the wet fine. The spread is less than it was with the wet fine. There's a little bit of shading, kind of. I mean, if you look at above them on the third line, above is lighter than them, which is quite a bit darker, and lightens up around it. So it does show that there's some shading capability here with this paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, still really getting that kind of pink-leaning red tone. Yes, it feathers. Yes, it spreads. No, it does not shade. No, you shouldn't use this ink on this paper because it's garbage. Looking at the back of the page, we see that, yeah, the ink got very deep into the paper. You cannot write on both sides of this page. Not a surprise there. However, nothing bled through touching the page underneath. So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The soft fine was lighter, but I like the tone I'm getting, and somehow it's keeping it a magenta really well with this being such a dry pen. Now the wet fine gives a very dark magenta with no shading, but a beautiful tone on the page. The medium is lighter than the wet fine and does shade some, but isn't as good to look at as that wet fine. The broad can make it look kind of like a pinky magenta and does shade kind of well. It's a tone here I really don't care for. So for me, the wet fine really guides me in wanting a wet pen for this very dark magenta, even though it won't shade. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.